In this paper, we're going to look at healthy young Marines and how they developed long COVID despite being healthy and what this looked like in this cohort of individuals. Now, there's several reasons why we care about this study. The first being that this is taking our cream of the crop healthy population, young Marines, young adults, and we're showing that they are at potential for developing long-term disability through long COVID. We currently don't know if long COVID is a condition one can actually recover from, so we'll just assume that it's at least long-term morbidity, so long-term health issues over time, which is alarming for a few reasons, because if this becomes a disabling event for the rest of their lives, since it happened so young, this is a very large chunk of time that the person will now have a disability for that they otherwise wouldn't have had. Two, it's showing that a very healthy, immune robust population is still susceptible to these issues. It's not just something that's for people with weakened immunity and weakened immune systems. And then three, in terms of these are Marines from a military standpoint, you don't want to have a literally weakened army and fighting force. Now, this was a longitudinal study, so it was done at multiple time points over time, and it was a prospective observational study, so they were observing these people over that time, and then also looking back and comparing the data to the historic data. So basically, they did physical fitness tests, they took a questionnaire, you have that information, the person got sick, you have more questionnaires, more data collected for their physical fitness, their abilities, things like that later on in time, so you can compare that from the current time to the past time, and that's the looking back observational part of this. And to try and be super clear on that last point, so what I mean is that you have a cohort of Marines before COVID for the data, so you have between 2016 2019, you have an non-COVID infected population for the physical fitness data that they're comparing to. You have Marines before their infection and Marines following their infection. So you have a comparison of both before and after, and then the comparison of this after infection group to that historic pre-COVID group. So that's what I mean by that. And for people that met all the criterion in their longitudinal study, for the people that got infected with COVID, there were 900 approximately Marines that met those criterion. They were followed up with at about 330 days following initial enrollment in this study. And among those Marines, there were 798 COVID-infected participants out of the 899. And of those 798 COVID-infected participants, 197 developed long COVID, according to their 4-week definition. So this number might be a little higher from a 3-month definition. It might be slightly lower if they expanded it to 3 months as the minimum inclusion window for long COVID. So this is a pretty high number, just around a quarter of Marines, healthy Marines with no underlying conditions, developed long COVID after a COVID infection. And this approximately 25% rate of developing long COVID was in 2022, I believe. So yeah, 2022 is when this number would be coming from. And we know that with each cumulative infection, the risk increases, so this number would only be going up. And the other part to really emphasize here is that while a quarter of these U.S. Marines developed long COVID, the vast majority of their infections were either asymptomatic or mild. So they had asymptomatic, so no symptoms, or a very mild infection, something that they're just like, oh, it's just the sniffles. And then after that infection, they started reporting physical, cognitive, or psychiatric long-term effects following that infection. And not only that, but these Marines affected with long COVID showed a long-term decrease in their functional performance, suggesting that COVID infection may negatively affect your health for a long time for a significant proportion of young adults. So even though you're considered young and healthy, this can have very dramatic and drastic long-term impacts on your physical and cognitive health. Now, why is this such damning evidence? Well, it's because a population of active duty U.S. Marines is unique in that it's a bunch of young people that are very healthy. They're at the peak of physical fitness, and they have very little to no comorbid conditions because those are exclusionary factors a lot of the times from being able to even participate in the military itself. Furthermore, more than 90% of these participants in the study were serologically naive at enrollment, meaning that they didn't have a prior COVID infection, meaning that the COVID infection that they got that developed long COVID for them was their first COVID infection, or maybe their second, but again, very small numbers of COVID infections that resulted in long COVID. And this is one part of the record that I really want to emphasize in the data here is that with a mild infection, the green, you see that it transverses all categories so that you have pretty consistent basis that just a mild infection can cause these long COVID symptoms, that moderate and severe infections can result in very specific subsets of systems. We sort of see this at higher rates for things like loss of appetite, headache, tiredness, joint pain, body aches, pain and or problems swallowing, exercise intolerance, difficulty breathing and shortness of breath, etc. But we see this being more prevalent in mild cases with the changes in ability to move, changes in ability to think and or behave, sudden onset of neurological problems, changes in levels of consciousness, some eye issues and hearing problems. So these are all things that can happen in a mild infection, and we're starting to see more of this type of stuff with moderate and severe, but also at similar rates to the mild infection itself. So that's pretty alarming. What this shows you is that any COVID infection, regardless of how severe the actual infection is itself, if you develop long COVID, is going to impact you in a myriad of ways, just as a moderate or a severe infection would. Now, in terms of their physical performance, these Marines on their 3-mile run, they specifically lost 25 seconds in their run, so they were 25 seconds slower compared to the cohort of Marines from 2016 to 2019, predominantly because of these COVID infections that resulted in long COVID, where Marines with long COVID had significantly decreased physical fitness test scores up to a year later post-infection, because that's how long the study went out for. Probably is going to go on for longer, but for their 3-mile run, they averaged within the 65th percentile of their reference cohort, and other overall fitness scores were reduced. However, the poorest run times and overall scores were seen among these long COVID individuals, which is indicative of ongoing functional effects. And while there didn't appear to be a reduction in strength and marksmanship, from this cohort, they did find that in this same cohort of COVID-infected individuals, they had prolonged dysregulation of the immune system, where this dysregulation was appearing like autoimmune diseases would.